very interesting kind of reason for me being here. Another issue is what's this all about? And when I heard that the Sustainable Development Goals were being created, I was a bit like, oh yeah, more UN stuff, more high-level stuff, miles away from people's normal lives. Actually, I've been hugely impressed by the goals and their permeation into all aspects of civil society and the ability to use them as the hook on which you do everything. And then fantastic that we now have a goal for cities, which is number 11. It was very hard to get the UN to agree to anything that was cross-cutting because they like subjects, which is a bane of town planners' lives. And then Habitat 3, which was the year later, was the declaration on how cities will be planned in the world, signed by the various governments that are members of the UN. And one of the interesting things was point 66 in the New Urban Agenda is we will commit ourselves to using digitization to provide options for inhabitants to make more environmentally friendly choices. That's quoting from it. There's other stuff in Article 66, but I think that's quite interesting because we are here to talk about decision making. And one of the biggest questions about decision making is, well, who makes them? Who gets to use the data and to answer which questions? We've been looking at sort of how town planning relates to society's challenges for 5 years ago, since our centenary work, particularly around making better decisions for places. I've got some copies of that document, which is centered around this question of data is not value free. Data is generated by people for purposes, and different people get to use it, and that's a very highly contested question. And we think particularly the smart city agenda is one that needs very careful critique, because you find a lot of it is driven by companies that stand to gain a lot from the adoption of smart cities. So sort of it's important for society to question that, and we've been questioning with our Smart City Regions project, which is around the fact that the issue is, well, what are the territories in which data operates? It's not just a question of sort of which class in society has access to data, but which space has access to data. And we're particularly interested in the use of data across city regions, which is something which around the world is quite a challenge. Many countries have a problem that the actual units of government are far too small to deal with the challenges that they face, the previous list of challenges. So how do you get areas to cooperate? And we've been looking at some good news. So I know I'm going to come on to the good news about the use of data. For example, London has the advantage of being a very large area with a single government. It's actually one of the largest areas in the world that has a single government, created, I should say, in the face of fierce opposition. I mean, the creation of the Mayor of London, the GLA, was something which was massively politically contested. The Greater London Council had been abolished previously, and the existence of the Greater London Authority is actually itself a great driver for the creation of data, and it's very committed to creating data. This is a platform which is used to pool all the information around the platform for utilities to log where they are going to invest in new transport, electricity, gas, fibre infrastructure, so that it makes it easier to work out where you can easily provide more housing, because you've already got the infrastructure either in existence or planned. The recent heat wave has shown a great deal of interest in the issue of where are the greatest problems for heating, and cities have this built-in difficulty of lots of hard surfaces, very prone to heat waves, and this is something we can use data to check and also look into, well, if you're going to build in areas with high prone to heating, how is that going to shape how you design your buildings and your streets? And then another one, outside London, fascinating work done by the the consultancy space syntax on the difficulty of getting people to services in Milton Keynes, which was a city built, famously on the assumption that everybody over the age of 16 would drive. Interesting assumption made in 1968, and patently not true. Even if we didn't have a climate crisis, the whole social issue of the use of motor cars is very suspect. And here we have data modeling to say, well, how are you going to deal with the fact that people in one car families need to get to, say, the surgery when that one car is in use because someone has had to use it to get to work? This brings us to a broader kind of regional question, which is on the location of housing, which is a very big political discussion at the moment. This is what the RTPI itself did on mapping where all the permissions for housing in the period 2012-2017 are. And the reason we did this is because there is a very strong political objection to the principle of town planning. It has a lot of enemies. You don't have to look very long in the press to see yet another attack on the existence of planning at all. The reason we did it was to say, well, actually, generally speaking, our planning system has done very well in acting in such a way as to keep housing development within certain territorial limits. So actually, over those 5 years, 74% of the housing permissions were within 10 kilometres of a major employment centre. Only half of the housing permissions are within easy walking or cycling distance of a railway, metro or underground station. And that's under the current planning system. So if we have what the critics of planning call reform, i.e. less planning, bear in mind we're starting from a situation where only 50% of housing development is sustainable in active travel terms. So we're already just about like swimming, your head is just about above water. If you take away what supports that, you'll be looking at a very much less sustainable kind of planning system based on what landowners want to do with their land. Which brings me to the less good news. So in this great debate over the use of data, some of the most powerful proponents of using data are the people who wish to what they call liberalize. So this is the idea of removing government and communities' control over land use and handing it over to owners. And the data part of this process is one of the key attributes. So the argument goes, we need lots of data, which will then tell every owner of every parcel of land in the country what they can do with their land according to what the data tells you. So it's interesting, it comes back to the previous point around how many options does the decision maker have. And once that data is all accumulated and put into some vast, great kind of computer that covers all the different aspects, then landowners will be, inverted commas, free to do whatever they want because the data will kind of give them the answers. So if you own a site of science, special scientific interest, the computer will tell you you can't do anything with it because it's an SSSI. And so there's a kind of linkage between the data community and the not having planning community, which I find quite suspicious, which is why I'm being provocative this morning. So here is an enormously argumentative and contested issue, which is the green belt around London. One of 14 green belts in England. They all are actually quite different. You can see another one, which is the Oxford one, floating around there in the corner. We just missed the Cambridge one, which is quite small. Very different circumstances with the different green belts, different reasons for having them. Again, a lot of the debate is based on the London green belt, which is utterly unique and not like any of the others because it's so large. And the argument here is, and you may have seen it on the news, is the green belt is not all nice. So therefore we should build on the bits of it that aren't nice. And we'll have a computer, we'll have data that tells us what's nice and what isn't, and where it isn't nice you can build on it. End of story. And won't that be wonderful, because people will be free to do what they want. So here we have the London Green Belt broken down into different bits. We have the area of outstanding natural beauties, we have the SSSIs, and then we have what's interestingly called the areas of no interest. And it's quite interesting actually, so in terms of a social critique, because the areas of no interest tend to be the areas that are poorer for kind of obvious reasons. So anyway, I went on a walk around the green belt. Here's a bit of it. This is an area of no interest, which is by the Grand Union Canal. And if you turn through 180 degrees, that is the view. So the Greenbelt has indeed got lots of areas that are very ugly, but one of the questions is sort of, first of all, one argument for that is instead of putting a housing estate on it, you could say, well, let's make it better. The solution to unattractive landscape isn't necessarily that you have more houses, it could be that you improve the landscape. And another problem on this, taking this Greenbelt case study, is that actually the lobby that says that we should build on the Greenbelt also says that we should have another layer of data which comes in and says if you're within 2 kilometres of a railway station you can build there, providing it's not also an SSSI or an area of outstanding natural beauty. So we're starting to layer all this data up into some great big system which you can, wonderfully query through your data tools. The problem is if you put houses next to stations, people don't use trains, which we can prove here. So all these are very satisfactory towns with wonderful train services into London. What happens if you live in Maidenhead is you probably work in Reading or Maidenhead or Watford or High Wycombe. You might work in London, but not that many people do. And of course, if you want to work anywhere else other than London, you have to use a car. So the data that level of data doesn't deal with the fact that human behaviour won't work that way, and ironically we're using data here to refute the argument that you can simply have layers and draw circles around stations and expect people to behave like that. The other problem with data is that quite a lot of the data, and this is something that you may reform through your work, tends to be describing the world as it is now. So yes, we have all these railways that are going out of London, and you can draw nice 1 kilometre circles around them and say everyone's going to live there, but that assumes that we don't have any more railways. Interestingly enough, this month is the 80th anniversary of the extension of the Piccadilly line in London to Cockfosters, which was then in the middle of nowhere. It was in the countryside. What that enabled was that lots of people could go and live in that part of the world and commute back into London in the days when that's what people tended to do. So one of the questions about the use of data is, are you measuring what may happen if different investments are made? Here's an example where there was a railway from Braintree to Stansted, well, Bishop Stortford, a while ago, and it was closed under the orders of Dr. Beeching. And since then, that part of the world has been utterly transformed. I mean, it's not far from here. So we have an international airport. We have a phenomenal amount of housing growth, particularly in the 60s, 70s and 80s in North Essex and East Hertfordshire. And then we have a very large road, the A120's all been built. But if you'd thought of building a new railway from, it would have to be from Colchester to Stansted, to high specification and part of a wider link, then what you could do is put some housing development in the middle of it, which would help fund it. Actually, the proposals for housing development in North Essex have nothing to do with this at all. They're all based on, guess what, data on the fact that landowners own plots of land around North Essex and they can develop them, because if they're an area of no interest and you drill down through all the different layers and it's still no interest, then the data system says, well, you can build. The trouble is that would mean building in very dispersed locations. A similar issue on a larger scale, and here we do see Cambridge, is the proposed Oxford to Cambridge railway. Again, actually not a new railway, but a replacement from another one that was closed massively, ill-advisedly, about 50 years ago. And the question here then is, Cambridge has got a huge question about shortage of housing, but the answer to that question isn't a Cambridge question, because if you're going to build this railway, perhaps the answer should be that halfway between Cambridge and Bedford you put a new town, which will help fund this railway, and it will also meet some of the housing shortages and also enable people to live in that town and work somewhere else, because people don't work where you tell them to, like we said. But there needs to be some way of actually including these investment decisions that have positive feedbacks into a process, which means the data needs to link, always looking forward and always thinking of investment possibilities, and particularly the alignment of investment by all sorts of different decision makers. So in this case, this would require housing, electricity, gas, transport and health and education investment to happen in the same place at the same time, which is something which is our fragmented decision-making process is very much predicated against. So as I say, we looked at this paper, which is not only making better decisions, as we've been hearing about in your workshop, but also making the decisions in the right places and by the right people, particularly in the right places. So who gets to decide where the railway from Oxford to Cambridge goes? Is that Whitehall? Is that people in this region? Is it people in county councils? Is it people in district councils? And then it comes back to money. So one of the issues that we have that's quite strange in England is a very, very centralised approach to spending. We modelled this in the Horizons paper, and there are 4 cells in this matrix. So the top left-hand corner is where national governments are making national decisions. So HS2 is an example of this. The national government is making a national level decision with its own money. Well, that's all fair and good. That's what most countries do. The bottom left-hand corner, type 2, which is where the decision mainly impacts on a locality, but the decision is made by the national government using its own money. That's what this country has an awful lot of. If there's anyone who knows anything about the history of the Leeds tram, they will know that we have national government making local decisions, which is a very odd thing to do and not terribly efficient. And then the bottom right-hand corner is where you have local governments making their own decisions with their own money about their own stuff, which is quite common in many countries other than this one. And here we have a tale of 2 cities. There's Leeds on the left with its sorry story of it can't have, it has no public transport other than buses, although it's nearly 1 million people. By contrast, Malmö on the right is a city that recovered from an enormous post-industrial crisis with the end of shipbuilding, but because it's a city that's free to make its own decisions, it's invested in all sorts of fascinating activities in conjunction with Copenhagen across the Sound, including, for example, the Öresund Eco-Mobility Project, uniting universities, companies and municipalities across the Swedish-Danish border in an effort to increase capacity in climate-friendly transport. They didn't have to ask permission to do that because that town hall there is able to make its own decisions and raise its own money. In fact, I believe in Sweden, if there may be some Swedish person here to correct me, that actually all the taxes are collected by the locality and then the government is given its share of them. Whereas in this country, as you know, of course, they're all collected centrally and then doled out according to nationally set priorities. We didn't always used to do this. So here is Keith Joseph, the architect of Thatcherism on the right-hand corner. In a previous incarnation, he was very much in favour of planning. One of the things he did was to plan London and the South East, and here's the 1964 study. The big new towns in blue, including Milton Keynes, you may recognise up there at the top, and then also fascinating, the expanded town principle, the brown ones, including Ipswich and the one near Stansted, which didn't get built. We were using this housing supply for the next 20 years. The decisions made in the middle of the 60s were supplying London and the South East with housing well into the late 80s. We now have a housing crisis. Guess what? Because we didn't do this again. We didn't replace it 20 years later with another plan. We just let everything kind of run down into the sand. So this is why I think the data that is generated needs to be generated in such a way that it can involve these decisions rather than decisions by individual landowners one at a time, which can lead to all sorts of downsides. This is a map of decision-making bodies in England. It's quite hard to follow, but basically the darkish blue colour is the places that don't have joint decision-making capability. The pale blue colour includes the places that do, and then it was Yorkshire Day yesterday. Yorkshire is in a class of its own. It has a very different story. So going back to smart city regions, if the data is gathered and generated and used for decision-making across wider areas, it can lead to some better results. So having challenged the role of data, what would I suggest you do? Well, here's an example. So going back to my Stansted example, we do have data on public transport accessibility, for example, like the GLA's demonstrated. But what you need to do is to link that with what there could be if we had more investment. So we need a number of new surfaces, and maybe there are scenarios, I'm not in to know, but hey, we need a number of scenarios that say if we invested, I don't know, several £1 million in improving the connection between Braintree and Stansted, what then could we do? What different surfaces would we have? What different kind of income flows would we be able to generate, merging the static data with the possibilities? And we are publishing later this year some work we've been doing actually in this area, plus Staffordshire and in Glasgow, around how you do integrated investment decision making, and how you overcome the massive difficulties. Not actually, the data isn't the problem there. The difficulty is having 11 or 12 different organisations with utterly independent and sometimes conflicting business purposes, all of which somehow need to be brought into a brought together by a ringmaster, and that we think that's what we do, so that they can pull together and actually facilitate growth in their areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We have time, a couple of minutes for questions. Lex.
Hi Richard, my name's Lex Comber. I'm at the University of Leeds, and I live in Nottingham, and we've got a great chances there. I wanted to just reassure you, I think, that the kind of work you were saying about planning and simulating future needs is going on, but they're not people in this room. So there's a large group of urban simulators, people looking at the impact, what would happen with autonomous vehicles, and essentially all the research is showing that autonomous vehicles won't change anything, because cars are like water, they'll fill any space that's occupied, etc., etc. And perhaps one of the hooks you could make is with the Alan Turing Institute, and they've got a large urban analytics team led by Mark Birkin, who's also at Leeds. And I just suggest you get in touch with those. They've got lots and lots and lots of activity in this area.
Great, that's exciting. Now, one thing I didn't mention is that we are working with the Connected Places Catapult, and there's a whole sort of work stream around what's called Plan Tech. There's a conference next month on the 19th, which is to do with quite a lot is about processes. So, are there easier ways of submitting planning applications and then drawing information from them by machine reading, for example? But that's rather different, I think, from the decision-making data.
So there was also a presentation on some of the state-of-the-art in urban modellings in the opening workshop at the beginning of July. So that presentation will be available to view online through the INI website. James.
Thanks very much for that. I was interested, there were a couple, one or two comments you made concerned what we might think about in terms of human movement. So you said about putting towns in, assuming people will use them in certain ways to move to other places for work, say, and that didn't really fall out as people expected. So one issue that's been talked about, probably a bit, not in great detail here, but a few of us chatted about the last couple of weeks, is understanding movement. I work on movement of plants and animals, but talking to people who look at human movement and trying to apply some of the understanding from the ecological world. So human movement in this case might be movement to where you work, commuting, but also within cities and towns. One particular thing we talk about is moving to access green spaces. Where you put your green spaces, what your infrastructure is, does that allow just the wealthier people to get these green spaces? How do you get more poorer people to access those and whatever? So it's quite an area of interest. So I just wanted to throw that out and get your thoughts or comments on whether is that an issue which your team considers. Do you think it's a data issue, something that might be...
Well, the data snag is that we have the census, and that data that we use is from the 2011 census, but it only records people's movements to work. So it's quite a sort of 1950s view of how people live, that they just commute and don't do anything else. It's something like barely 20% of all movement. So my other argument about the building round stations thing is, of course, that even if you look at commuting, people don't go by train to central London, but actually they also do everything else, usually by car, because it's a limited proportion of all the total movements. There's not a huge amount of data on those other movements other than the National Travel Survey, but I'd be fascinated to get introductions to where more stuff is available.
So just sorry to follow up on that, is that this is working with a guy called Ronaldo and Menezes down in Exeter, and so there's access to a lot of data from mobile phones,
Yes.
from city bikes, etc. So there is rich data, so I think there's probably a link to the
Mm.
data.
Yeah, I'm going to draw itself, because otherwise you're going to miss your coffee break otherwise, which I think is next. Just to say, there are many issues I think that we'll be discussing over this month that speak to your presentation, particularly sort of modelling human processes and movement and pressure of housing and population on the landscape system. And we have been sort of grappling with some of the issues you were talking about, actually, about if we assume that everyone makes rational decisions, which we know doesn't happen in reality. How can we represent that in our models in a better way than we currently do? But thank you, please. Can we join? Thank you.